Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Brandy Berry, Program Manager at ISPE, and I'll be your host today. We've opened the session a few minutes early to make sure everyone can get settled and ensure that you have a good connection. We'll get started at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. While we're waiting, I'll cover a few tips to help you get connected. If you are experiencing any issues with sound or connection, please try the phone dial-in option. You can see if you have a local number in your area by checking the control panel on the right side of your screen. You can switch to a local number at any time. Just look for your number, dial in on your phone, and change from computer audio to phone call. Please turn off your computer audio or you'll hear an echo or feedback. If you're dialing in via phone, please use the audio pin, which is also available in your control panel. This will connect your phone audio to your computer presence. Another tip that you may want to consider if you have any connection issues is using a wired internet connection instead of Wi-Fi. And if all else fails, you may want to try disconnecting and reconnecting, as that helps. If you do experience any issues or miss any content, you will receive a link to listen to the recording and view the presentation, as well as a PDF of the presentation content within 24 hours of today's session, and you'll have access to this content on demand for 30 days. Before we get started, I'd like to launch a poll to see where you're all joining us from today, and we'll leave this open until we get started. So if you could all input what region you're joining us from, and I will review the results once we get a majority of your input. Great, so we see we have a majority of our attendees who have responded, so I'll close out the poll and share the results with you. We have 41% joining us from Europe, 34% from North America, 18% from the Asia Pacific region, 4% from Africa and the Middle East, and 3% from South America. So thank you all for joining us today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, CSV versus CSA, GAMP 5's Actionable Steps to Transitioning Your Validation. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brandy Berry, Program Manager at ISPE. I'll review a quick housekeeping items before we get started with the presentation. Today's webinar will be 60 minutes long with approximately 45 minutes for presentation and 10 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions for the speakers today, please submit them at any time throughout the presentation via the questions option in your right side control panel. So just drop down that pane and put your questions. We'll do our very best to get to as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end. This session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording and a PDF of the presentation within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. And you'll have access to this content on demand for 30 days. I'm reviewing some of our connection information. If you do have trouble with your sound, you may use the phone dial-in option. That information is in your control panel under the audio section and also in the email that you received with the link to join today. You may also want to try a hardwired connection instead of Wi-Fi, or disconnect and reconnect if all else fails. And again, you will receive a video and PDF to review the content, and access to that will be available for 30 days. Now let's get started by introducing our speakers for today. So we have Amy Wilhite, Validation Engineer at Kneat, and Michael Lanasa, Associate Director of Global Quality Compliance at Merck & Co. Welcome, Amy and Michael. Thank you for joining us.
All right, so I'll share my screen and we can take a look at our slides here. All right. So today we're looking at our popular topic, which is the CSV versus CSA. Basically what GAMP 5 says about it, and some actionable steps that we can take to start using these approaches. So when we are looking at the updated GAMP guidance, basically what they say will help us to adopt these approaches. The second edition came out in July of 2022, so we've had a little bit of time to digest what has been written to interpret it for how it's going to apply to the industries that are using these approaches today. We are subject matter experts in specifically electronic validation that applies to life sciences industries and computer systems validation. So we have some approaches here that we've kind of put together for these industries to kind of help push people along into this new approach and make it a little bit less scary to adopt. So the entire guidance needed to change for the purpose of getting on board with everything going kind of digital. There's the terminology that's been thrown out for the past several years with Pharma 4.0 and the kind of digital maturity pathway that everyone's going to be on and is going to want to be taking to get our journey going to adopt these approaches. So a lot of the guidance that was previously written was very paper-based or even hybrid-based. And so the things that needed to change were not necessarily the overall key concepts of having, you know, your content validated and verified to a state that's acceptable by the regulatory bodies and for, you know, consumer safety and quality, but it's been updated to reflect kind of the importance of having things being provided by cloud services, the IT service providers, the agile approaches to software development, the iterative models, the increased availability and use of these digital tools to help kind of automate and facilitate the way that we approach these processes and validating them. So there's several updates that were made to the actual GAMP guidance. We have just pointed out some of the key areas that you'll notice if you're reviewing the GAMP 5-second edition versus the original edition. So you'll see there's some increased terminology that's been modified or added based on things like software tools, blockchain, AI, machine learning. I know that's kind of its own big topic in itself, how to validate those. IT infrastructure, using your critical thinking to kind of help reduce testing where needed, and identifying the critical path for the most important tasks and activities to kind of get you on the least burdensome documentation approach possible. And then there's some additional content here on electronic records and requirements. So those are just some of the kind of high-level sections that were changed. But we do have some of the specific components called out, and we'll go over those in these slides here. So some of the key takeaways that we got out of the GAMP 5-second edition are paraphrased here in our own internal interpretation of those findings. I know that there's panels, professional organizational panels, like the ISPE has their own specific teams for electronic validation and for computer systems assurance, and so they have you know, experts, panelists that read those guidances and come up with additional guidance, and these are just kind of our interpretations of those as a subject matter expert who sees customers validating their computer systems every day, and all of the different processes and methods that customers use to validate those, how auditors respond to those, and then the validation of our own computer system that is used by life sciences companies, and how that is impacted in their core processes. So the kind of first one that we like to preach where possible is that you should definitely leverage your vendor testing where possible. There are definitely some updates that a lot of customers need to make to be able to leverage their vendor documentation. For example, you need to have a good vendor assessment process that allows you to leverage vendor documentation from accomplished vendors, with reputable vendors, vendors who have documented validation packages and things like that available for you to leverage, and includes having the risk-based approach that doesn't require you to do additional testing when you already have a suite of testing that you can leverage that's been provided by the vendor. So you can see here, this is kind of the actual section, the reference, if you would like to look these up in the GAMP 5-second edition, where the text come from, and then the kind of header is our takeaway from these statements. So in this first one here, we see that the verification activities performed by the supplier or service can be leveraged here by the regulated company. So that's something that we like to kind of preach whenever we can, that if your vendor has the documentation, it's great to leverage that where you can. And that kind of feeds into the second one here, where you can reduce your overall testing by leveraging the existing data. So when you have things in a digital format with the new digital frontier and Pharma 4.0, you have so many digital records now that are more easily available. The information is more accessible now. You have these artifacts that allow you to have testing that is automated. So you have all of this documentation, and being able to just leverage that existing data is very helpful, and it's a lot more easy to do now that everything's kind of in a digital world. It wasn't as easy to do when it was all on paper or hybrid, because even some of the items in a hybrid format are not digital data elements that can be machine read and queried and searched and easily found. So now that we have this approach and we are seeing a lot more data that is digital, we can start leveraging this existing data a lot more easily. So you can see here the statement here is that just provided the information is complete, accurate, available, that demonstrates that the system is intended fit for use in its validated state. So having the ability to have your SOPs and your approaches and your strategies, your validation strategy align with the intent to leverage these types of things, this existing data based on your own internal assessment of risks for leveraging that data, you're able to set yourself up to really take advantage of this massive amount of data that's just ready to go. And then this one, the third bullet, it's a little less impactful, but we do see a lot of customers have the routine of rebranding vendor documentation with their own internal client logos, or maybe they even have like specific SOPs that say, at maybe a URS or something like that. Maybe in this case, a vendor documentation would be more like a functional spec. Like a functional spec has to conform to very specific requirements, including like section header names and types of bulleted lists are included. And if the vendor documentation doesn't conform to those, then there's an issue, and then the company kind of has to recreate those entire documents in their own client aesthetic. So we kind of see that taking a more risk-based approach, using your critical thinking to determine like whether or not that kind of thing is really important, updating your processes so that you maybe don't have to necessarily do that, and you can just leverage the vendor documents as is actually more valuable than using the time to kind of recreate those things in your own aesthetic. Some of the automation tools that are now available with this Pharma 4.0 and the digital maturity pathway are even preferred now over the manual techniques that have been used historically. The example of this would be something like a requirements trace matrix, where you might have a system that is able to link requirements specifically to test cases and protocols, and then potentially trace those back to additional specifications or risk assessments or things like that. And that's all controlled via the connectivity and the relationship between the digital data elements. So it takes the kind of human error aspect out of the equation, and is found to be more preferred over the manual generation of those items, just to conform again to a traditional aesthetic for maybe how that looks in a table, or how the different relationships are organized or pointed out, is found to be a little less valuable to recreate those just for the purpose of that than to leverage the automated tools that might exist for that in a given application. The issue reporting was one of the topics that was raised up in the GAMP 5 second edition, that has been kind of called out as, I know a lot of historically more documentation is best, and so you want to over justify and over conclude any kind of issues or problems that may have occurred to make sure that everything looks irrefutable in the end protocol. But we're finding that the minor errors, things that are not impactful, transcription errors, protocol generation errors, basically any errors that are documentation based, that are not based on an actual failure of the acceptance criteria from a functional and proof case perspective, are not as valuable and take up a lot of time during the audit to be reviewed. So there's kind of this move towards, yes, you want to acknowledge those kinds of errors, but having intricate documentation that's pages and pages long with paragraphical justification for why a typo is really a typo is not as value added as previously it was interpreted to be. So more focus on the test evidence to determine an actual pass or fail step is more valuable here when you're looking at errors than minor issues, documentation issues, and things like that. So that can help reduce the overall documentation burden by having a process specifically to handle those issues a separate way and not requiring as much documentation, not requiring as much of a process stop or all stop to the protocol execution or things like that that can bottleneck the process. So the V model, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the V model approach to validation. This is an example of where you can where you can have a split in the way that you're handling this process based on how you've interpreted your vendor's documentation that is able to be leveraged. So this is going to help to have the ability to leverage your vendor documentation, assuming that you've assessed them correctly, you've got a good validation strategy in place, your risk assessment approach is justified and all that, and you can kind of see the split to where this information is becoming useful. So in the top here, you've got your regulated company's system lifecycle. So they're creating their application. They are going to verify the functions and the intended use of the application. So where you can leverage the kind of supplier's information from the bottom here is over on the right. So if you have not assessed your vendor and found that they're reputable and you can leverage their documentation based on their content that they have, then you might have to, as a regulated company, also do additional requirements testing, functional testing, integration testing, module testing. Any of the information that you've got in your own system lifecycle is not going to be suitable to be leveraged by the vendor company because you either didn't have an assessment process in place, or maybe they're not a preferred vendor after you did the assessment process. So if you select a vendor that has these this reputation, has these deliverables available for you, you assess them correctly with your own internal strategy in place, then you can kind of skip above here to the red circle when you're using the preferred supplier and leverage all of their documentation. And so the only testing that you might need to do would be gap testing against your own internal requirements to make sure that that is something that's met by the system, because the system is going to be totally functionally validated by the vendor. So you just need to compare that against any of your internal requirements that you might have. And I have some more information on that in a couple of slides above too. And then when we're looking at the three different environments that are typically available when you're making changes to a particular software system, dev, val, and prod, there is new verbiage in here that indicates that when you have these multiple environments, testing for the purpose of these, the development and implementation of those for things like supplier testing, the exploratory, ad hoc, and the like, scripted testing for functionality purposes, and user acceptance testing to demonstrate that it's actually fit for use for your intended use, could be done in multiple environments. They could be done in any of the three environments, but they all contribute to the overall detection and assurance of that software's fitness for intended use. So we've got that here to kind of specify that that would indicate that they're functionally equivalent to each other for your testing needs. So just because you have testing that's done in dev, because it's called dev, or because it's called your test environment, or something like that, it does not mean that it's totally invalid. And you would have the ability to leverage that for your production testing, assuming, of course, your instances are actually functionally equivalent and they're not deployed in different manners on different levels of servers or at different types of release readiness or things like that. But assuming it is all the same environment, then you can consider them functionally equivalent regardless of if the use of that is your production instance or not, based on this new guidance. So When we're looking at the kind of traditional approach to CSV versus the adoption of CSA approaches to make CSV easier, these are kind of the existing pain points that we see with a traditional CSV approach that does not incorporate the CSA elements. So you have a lot of documentation that's generated. You're typically doing things for the purpose of looking good in an audit or for the purpose of having the least amount of observations possible during the audit process. Just because everyone likes to, have an A+ and have all your information looking pristine. You've got typically your test scripts are several pages long because we've seen historically there's a common trend of putting things like navigational steps, prerequisites, non-proving steps throughout your test case, just to kind of help facilitate the flow of those easier, for just the human aspect of being able to navigate through each step and execute it. So seeing those makes the test scripts typically run into several pages long. And then it just takes a very long time to validate systems with a traditional CSV approach because you're validating the entire system without kind of consideration necessarily to which maybe features and functions of that system are the critical ones that have the impact that are important to maybe safety or quality. Maybe you even have high prioritized in your organization like legal or business risks. And so this is kind of a full documented validation of every function and feature the same way, rather than kind of assessing each one and validating it in an equivalent ratio with what the risk would be for the failure of that feature. And then we see a lot of folks who take all the time on testing on dry runs that maybe are not as fully documented or provided as clearly within the documentation that you would give to a regulatory body during an audit. You want to identify all of the testing errors and the issues with the system in a dry run before you actually do it in the validation, because the perception is that if you find issues during validation, it looks bad on you as a company, or because you didn't catch it earlier, or whatever the case may be. But the kind of value add to including all of the ugly with your initial validation is typically seen to save more time in the long run to kind of make this a more efficient process. So we're seeing less emphasis on the dry runs and getting everything perfect before the official validation, and more emphasis on, okay, maybe it failed during validation, but we fixed it, it's good to go now, and here's our retest in triplicate if needed, whatever the case may be. So that's typically more time saving than doing 10 dry runs just so that it looks pretty during the initial validation. And then addressing those test script errors and all the associated time and cost and impact, because a lot of the dry run issues that are found are not necessarily functional issues or issues with the software, but it's issues with the protocol or the procedure or something like that. And so taking the time prior to validation to continue to run scripts on your documentation is just not as value added as identifying all those at the time of validation and then taking a kappa to address those after the fact. So the kind of ratio that we see for documentation versus amount of testing and how that flips when you adopt a CSA approach is kind of indicated in this diagram. So if you are still doing a traditional all or nothing CSV validation approach, traditional CSV approach to validation, you are probably looking at something like an 80% documentation effort labor-wise versus 20% on testing. And so the goal is to kind of flip that and only have about 20% of your labor and time and effort being on the documentation of those, and then spending 80% of your time on testing, because that's during the testing is where you're going to find the critical issues, or errors or exploratory findings or anything like that are going to help to ensure that you have the best quality product possible. It's going to be in the testing, not necessarily in how pretty your documentation is. So we have some columns here that just kind of go over some of the details on the differences here. So again, you've got your CSV process that focuses on how good you look in an audit, meeting those regulatory regulations, whereas CSA is really emphasizing how good of a quality product you have, how secure it is, the overall end result of the product, not necessarily your documentation package. Validation of the entire system as a whole, the same way for the entire system, versus maybe looking at different features, functions, operations of that system, and then validating those differently depending on how high risk they are, how critical they are, what the impact of the failures might be, what the intended use of those might be, what kind of testing is available for those things. You can assess them in a different way to reduce your testing to focus where it's going to be the most valuable. Kind of not being as documentation heavy for all of those scripted tests, and focusing more on allowing unscripted tests for things like ad hoc testing, exploratory testing, day in the life testing, error guessing, those things that you just have not really a test plan or specific steps that you're following, but you are working towards an objective, and then you're documenting your results as you need to work through the system to accomplish that objective. So it's a lot less documentation heavy if you can just kind of have an objective, do whatever you need to do to accomplish it, and then document your results, versus follow hundreds of steps to maybe end up at the same place. So those are some of the differences that we see there. And then this is kind of a good ratio of where you should balance that documentation. So where you do need those scripted tests that are step-by-step, that have very specific procedures that you need to follow to accomplish a particular outcome for your testing, would be for things that are deemed throughout your very extensive assessment process more risky. And I know I have these kind of listed as like more risky and less risky in a binary aspect, just for the purpose of this example in this presentation, but your risk assessment process would actually be very broad spectrum. It's an entire framework that you would use to determine what level of testing is required, based on things like assessing each function or requirement that you're testing against for its intended use, whether or not it's a risk to your process, to your business, to the quality of the product, maybe even to patient safety, maybe to for legal purposes, what activities need to be captured by the vendor to satisfy those, what records you need to capture to identify the potential failure modes for those. It's a very kind of intricate risk assessment process, and there's lots of guidance on it from the ISPE, from GAMP 5. There's lots of resources available so that you can kind of better your risk approach and your testing strategy assessment process, so that you can in the long run here only have about 5% of your testing that you need to do for a given system be critical, scripted, step-by-step, robust testing. And then you can free up about 95% of your other testing here for the less risky features and functions of the application, or the less risky requirements, that you can leverage things like unscripted testing. Maybe you even have some scripted testing, but it's the limited scripted testing, so it's a little bit less. So you can do ad hoc testing that doesn't have any test plans, that you are able to have some unscripted tests that allow you to do things like error guessing, exploratory searches, the day in the life, like I said, the the thing that you're testing against there is just the objective. You have a core objective. You'd like to accomplish XYZ by utilizing the system, and then you go and perform whatever steps you need to accomplish that, whether that's logging in, navigating over here, and publishing some items, and updating some elements, or configuring some attributes. Any of the steps that you need to do that are just included in the exploration that you need to do to accomplish your objective. And so you can document all those steps, any errors that you found, any blockers that you found along the way, but you don't necessarily need to come up with step-by-step predetermined testing ahead of time, which is a very large amount of time consumption. So the way that you can start using these approaches, it all sounds great, reduce testing, leveraging testing, not having to recreate anything in your own aesthetic. It all sounds great, but you do need a little bit of infrastructure internally to be able to adopt those methods and be covered for the purposes of an audit. You're able to justify your approaches, your strategy, and things because you have this infrastructure in place where you've gone through these justifications and these assessments, and you've allowed yourself to take these approaches because you've written it into your own SOPs. So this is kind of what you would want to do to adopt these in your own system. You've got your internal documentation needs. So this is just an example of some of the internal deliverables that we often see customers need to implement to bring in a new computer system into their, into their enterprise, into their organization. So these are things that you'll always need to do for, any kind of validation activity. You're going to have your own specifications, requirements that you might need to meet. Maybe you can leverage all of the vendors' documentation, but you might have your own based on your own internal use cases. You're going to want to do a risk assessment to, again, be able to prove that you can either leverage or not leverage, or skip testing, or have testing, or reduce testing where needed. You're going to have your supplier assessment that allows you to leverage those things. You're going to have all of your relevant SOPs and policies. One of the biggest things that we see in auditor findings is not the fact that a regulated company did not validate their computer system the right way or to the standard of that regulatory body. It's just that they violated their own SOPs in doing so. They left out some documentation that their own SOPs said that they were supposed to have, or they didn't do this particular testing that their own SOPs said they were supposed to do for that particular system. So it's more about making sure that your SOPs align with all of the approaches and strategies that you want to take to kind of get on board with the CSA approach, versus exactly what testing we think is going to be asked for by the auditor. If we have a justification for why that testing wasn't needed, and we've got our SOPs and our documentation to back us up, then it's not going to be an issue. So having those SOPs is definitely a core update that we recommend our customers make to allow them to even utilize these strategies. So those are some of the things that you would have. Some of the common SOPs to kind of get you going and get you started are things like good documentation policies. Obviously, if you're moving towards electronic systems and you have things like electronic records, electronic signatures, then you might have to change your GDP policy because wet signatures don't apply, blue-black ink doesn't apply, single line scratch through with a linking number identifier doesn't apply. So also having a business continuity plan in case of outages, power outages, or planned outages for an upgrade. Some of those are the more common things that are overlooked. So those are just some internal documentation aspects that you might want to update for making CSA a little bit easier to adopt. Almost done here. And then the vendor supplier assessment. So this is just, again, basically verbatim what GAMP 5 kind of recommends that you assess against your vendors. So making sure that they have a great support process, they have their own development process outlined, available to you, they're audit worthy as a service provider, they are in a public domain, they have market reputation, they've got reviews from clients that they've had before. Maybe they've got case studies. They get reviews from other regulatory companies. They have actual certification against the accredited quality standards that our regulated customers themselves need to adhere to. And so all of these things kind of go into the assessment. And if your vendor can prove, that they have these things to you, then you are much more able to leverage their documentation. So looking for a vendor that has these things is kind of a key, and then also allowing your process to assess your vendor against these things, and then say in your SOPs that if they follow these things, you can use them, is just a little stepping stone to make sure that you can leverage all of that information. So making sure that, again, your VP, whenever you're going to validate a new computer system, making sure that your validation plan is in alignment with all of that is pretty critical. And making sure that you have all of your intents kind of illustrated in your validation plan. If you intend to leverage the vendor's documentation because you've done the risk assessment, make sure that's in there. If you have any internal business risks that you need to assess against the vendor's information, make sure you've done that and you've shown that those are satisfied or not, and you have testing to fill that gap. Making sure that you have trace matrices available if you need to trace, vendor testing to your own internal requirements that are not going to be met by vendor testing for whatever reason. Having all of those things in your validation plan will kind of make the process a lot easier and more bulletproof during an audit scenario. And these are just some examples of maybe some occasions where you don't have vendor testing that you can leverage because your own internal requirements are creating a roadblock, or maybe are just very specific and unique, and some customers do need that and they do need to do extra testing for that. And then some things are just inevitable because there's too many possible configurations or options for a vendor to configure, so it would be up to the customer to configure their specific, or to verify their specific configuration. So these are some of those examples here. If you wanted to be able to generate, for example, you want to log on with your company-specific corporate credentials via single sign-on, then it's probably not likely that your vendor has validated your specific identity provider with the service provider with the exact SAML2 protocol that you follow to allow for your credentials to come in, whether or not it's multi-factor. All of those things are kind of aspects that you would want to do as an additional gap test, because the vendor probably is not going to have that, since it's technically a third-party application that you're coordinating with in there. If you have an SOP that says you have to always internally test any of your requirements that come back high risk, for example, regardless of if the vendor has tested it or not, that's an example of your SOP that's making you do extra testing that you may or may not need to do based on how you've done your assessment process. So that could be an update that you need to do there, but you'll obviously have to retest all those vendor things if you're finding that your risk assessment has certified those as a high risk, even if the vendor has already tested those. So that's an example of a gap testing that you need to perform if your own SOPs and procedures kind of force you to retest based on risk findings. And then again, the configuration example, if you have a specific application that is off the shelf even, but you want to validate your own specific configuration of those off-the-shelf elements, that might be something that you need to do in the form of like a UAT, rather than being able to just leverage the vendor testing, which says that you can do anything that you want with those elements, and where you're trying to say that you only wanted to do, X, Y, Z. However, if you do have any of those gap testing elements, the kind of approach here is to again try to make it more efficient, try to consolidate where possible. You don't necessarily need to have a separate UAT with those configuration requirements versus a separate OQ to revalidate the vendor's already tested OQ functions just because your risk assessment says those are higher risk, versus a verification that you need to do to verify that you can just get in with your single sign-on. You don't necessarily need 3 whole separate protocols, since those are different scopes of types of testing and levels of testing. You could potentially wrap those all up into something like a system acceptance test and execute them all as an assessment for the the actions that you need to do for accepting the system as a whole. You're accepting the system because you found these gaps when you were doing the assessment against the requirements and against the vendor testing. You intended to test those gaps. You've said that in your validation plan. So now you can wrap it all up. You call it acceptance testing, and then you can proceed rather than having to do all these kind of intricate protocols that follow the normal organization that you had previously. So those are just kind of reiterated here to start practicing those, make your internal procedures more CSA friendly. Again, your vendor assessment process, make sure that's clear, make sure you're using accredited vendors so that you can assess them as such and then use their content. Be flexible with your format. Don't necessarily have to rebrand everything or put your logo on everything, or even put things on the cover page. That can be time consuming just in itself. Having the ability to leverage those GAMP 5 second edition principles to reduce your overall testing by only documenting provable test steps. You know, maybe skip out the navigation stuff, skip out the prerequisites, put those in a different part of the test plan perhaps. And then having the different levels of testing planned based on the less risky, I'll say, less risky items that maybe you're only doing your ad hoc testing or your unscripted testing for those, and you don't actually need to have massive amounts of test evidence. You're just kind of providing your results there. And then just overall using your critical thinking for all of that. You can justify your approaches, if you have the evidence, the reasoning, your intended use, all the things that you need to kind of weigh in for why you've chosen to do something a particular way. As long as you justified it, then and you're able to explain your justification in an audit, then using critical thinking is going to help you out, because it's more valuable to have that and just explain it really quick in an audit than it is to take hours and hours and hours to document something just in case. For every single system, in your entire organization for that purpose. So those are kind of my remarks. I'll just briefly mention the validation, the state of validation survey, and then I'll hand it over to Mike. So this is something that allows us to get additional insights from folks in the industry. So the trends, the best practices, strategies that folks are employing. This is one of the ways that we are able to collect this massive amount of information that we have on customer processes, how customers are using these. So if anyone wants to participate in the state of validation survey, it's very useful, contributes to all of our knowledge. We do publish the results so that everyone can kind of get the feel for what everyone else is doing in the industry. So it's very helpful. There's a little scammy there in case you want to take that. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Mike.
All right. Thank you, Amy. Hello, good day. My name is Michael Lanasa. Everything Amy just presented, we have proceduralized and incorporate into our quality management system. And my responsibility is I'm in global quality, responsible for the life cycle of facilities, utilities, and equipment, which includes design, qualification, maintenance, calibration, sustained operation, and then decommissioning. So a few weeks ago, we were in the paperless validation COP, and I heard about this presentation. I said, wow, we just did this. We're taking advantage of the new guidance, which one of my favorites, appendix, is the critical thinking one. But as such, Merck transitioned from CSV to CSA as part of a global initiative to simplify and standardize our CQV process. And it was really successful. And really what I thought is that the industry would like to hear our story and then maybe ask some questions about our deployment. So this has proven to be a compliance improvement. And it also is a cost and schedule savings. In all fairness, I had a supportive role in the CSV to CSA transition. That was led by our digital and data integrity group. If you know Merck, we're a risk-averse company in many areas. So the implementation of CSA is somewhat elementary. And I think what you find with most organizations, at least from the end user perspective, is that the challenge is the change in mindsets and behaviors. You have to undo 25 years of thinking. It's one of the the sayings that we have here is transformational change is uncomfortable. And if you're not uncomfortable, then you're not transforming. And so for us, this was a huge lift. But we did it with a small group that was focused. And we're not done yet, though. We call this 1CQV. There'll be a 1CQV 2.0, and we'll continue to improve. So as part of restructuring our global quality manual, part of our digital transformation, each topic or chapter had to assess if there was a digital solution, if it was available and if it could be implemented. So we selected Kneat as the digital solution in the CQV space. We also got lucky because the head of global engineering solution asked, why is validation different from project to project related to the deliverables, strategy, cost? And so that opened the door to get senior leadership to sponsor and support the whole 1CQV methodology, of which CSV-to-CSA was a subset of. And it required cross-functional team all to come together, and global engineering, global quality, data and digital quality, our MMD IT, Merck Manufacturing Division IT, and then the sites. And we all had different perspectives. So early in the planning, we had spirited discussions, but we developed the process. And that team actually transitioned to what we call governance council, and we've coined the phrase manufacturing, laboratories, and computer systems community of practice, where we support both sustaining operations and projects. So some of the highlights in the time that we have left and that I want to focus on is the URS. It's the foundation of the qualification. I don't think we're alone in the industry with respect to most large capital projects sub out their URSs to the respective architectural and engineering firms. And you get inconsistencies even for identical systems. And generally, at least the way we used to think of things is a URS was a procurement or a contractual document in the olden days would just collect dust in your high density storage. Well, that's not the case anymore. The URS is a very critical document that captures the intent of ICH Q7 and Q8. It's a GMP lifecycle deliverable. And what's new in our process is that we've pulled all the relevant functional groups into the development of the URS. And it establishes the foundation for us to implement computer software assurance. Each requirement is assessed and scored, and we call it a system data integrity risk assessment. These are the things that Amy was talking about with respect to your suppliers and which documentation that you can leverage. And so we score it, and then from there we determine the level of testing. If it's a critical parameter or a CPP, high severity, robust scripted testing, whereas medium and low severities are ad hoc or exploratory testing, for example. And the inherent features of Kneat automate the generation of the RTM, which is rooted in the URS. So we combine this with predefined templates and scripts in Kneat that cover all the deliverables. So we got all the procedural stuff written. How did we deploy it? So what we ended up having to do was have workshops, or what I called roadshow. And we deployed at regions and sites to discuss and train people on the new strategy. And most importantly, all the functional groups spoke as one voice. And we went old school. So as part of the exercises, sometimes it was a day-long workshop, sometimes it was 2 days. We gave paper exercises and made people go through the integrity risk assessments and score and write a URS and sample test scripts with pen and paper. And we found that the workshops mirrored reality on what was happening in the shop floor. What I mean to say is discussion in the workshops was the same that was happening on the floor, where we spun on how to rank something, or more importantly, understanding the relationship between the IT automation guys and the process guys to determine which was critical. And discussion is good, churn's not. And so that governance council that we talk about, that's where projects or sites can escalate to get standardized direction and for us, a continuous feedback loop. So we get feedback like, who's best to complete a UAT? Should it be the partner, or should it be the actual end user? Or another one is transition from paper to glass. A lot of hiccups with respect to let's just take this test script that we did in paper, roll it into Kneat, and it'll work beautifully. That's not the case. You have to think differently. I use the analogy, if any of you are movie fans and you've seen the movie The Matrix, the original one, at the end of the movie when all of a sudden Neo sees, instead of people, he sees zeros and ones. And that's the way we have to think now. It's very different. So where we are in the process is we're collecting metrics on the savings. We're sharing it with our internal network, but this is absolutely a step in the right direction. It allows your respective experts to focus on their particular area as opposed to the documentation. So this reduces risk in the startup as we transition the focus from the documentation to the actual design and startup of the facility. So we have about 9 minutes left. We wanted to open it up for questions at this point.
Yeah, and I see we've got several that have come through in the chat. So there's a couple here that I can go ahead and address. So one of the questions was, does CSA only apply to medical device? So no, medical device would, even within like a medical device company, there's still going to be different levels of types of systems that are going to be used and what their intended use is. So if we take the medical device company example for consideration, there's going to be various various systems that are used directly as part of your production or quality system. So if you've got systems that are automating your production process, yeah, that's going to be a pretty big impact. And there's going to be probably more risky things that you're going to assess against the features and functions of those systems. That same medical device company, though, is going to have some software systems that just support the production or the quality system. So those are things that monitor the systems or automate testing activities, or just have like general record keeping that's not part of your actual quality record. So those things, you would assess those features and functions and intended use a little bit differently than you would things that directly impact your production system. And then you even have a further level of things that are just not considered to be part of the production system at all. And those are going to be things, software systems that are used for the management of your general processes or business operations, accounting operations, infrastructure for like networking or continuity of operations. So like if a system is like a learning management system versus a quality documentation management system versus maybe a CAPA an issue management system, those are all going to be kind of assessed in their own different ways against something that's like a control system on an automated assembly line that's making medical devices, and something goes wrong there and it's going to impact the product quality. So whether or not something impacts product quality is something that you assess, but either way you can use CSA to streamline those approaches regardless of how impactful they are to your product quality. One of the other questions I can go ahead and answer was, well, I can go ahead and comment on, was about AI and if we were going to have additional guidance coming out on AI. So I fully expect that there will be some guidance. I know a lot of the regulatory bodies have some subcommittees and things that are looking at those and having discussions with subject matter experts from the industry and what people are doing right now with AI, because there are a lot of companies that are creating their own AI right now. It's just kind of how much you can use your AI systems in those production systems and how they impact it, because AI currently is intrinsically very hard to validate due to the fact that it's impossible to make adequate outputs for various inputs and always get the same exact response, and having various untested input data contribute to exactly how your system behaves with your training data, and having those come out into iterations, because one small change in your training data is now a totally different output that you're getting from your AI. The lack of oracle that it has, the high dependency of the behavior of the training data and where that training data comes from. All those things are variables that are very hard to validate. So we're just seeing people start to kind of scratch the surface of what needs to be done for those systems. And I definitely expect there'll be some guidance coming out eventually once people have explored the traps and what to avoid with that.
I can take the, oh wait, so I just discovered the chat and the list of questions, sorry. I saw one related to the lack of documentation. So are we sure while looking at the document, oh wait, that was the wrong one, sorry. This was related to leveraging supplier information. I've been corrected by a regulatory agency where the supplier documentation can be leveraged as long as supplier's documentation listed within the company's quality documentation, as a supplier's documents are not governed by the company's QMS documents. So tricky area. It's actually a hot topic currently. So the key thing is, do you have a compliant portal within your QMS and your procedures to allow the use of supplier documents? Part of it is the risk assessment on which ones you can and cannot use. So the short answer is that you need to have a compliant portal within your QMS to determine what can and cannot be leveraged. Little bit different story, project compared to sustained operation, then you have supplier quality audit and some other elements, but that's my comment on that one.
And then I saw another one about maybe how to get more training on software system like Kneat, some of the software systems that are kind of becoming more integrated into the everyday workings of the life sciences companies. I know, just speaking for ourselves, we do have just publicly open accessible training online on Kneat.com. You can sign up for end user all the way up to super user level course instruction. So those are available. I think we even have some like forums and things on LinkedIn with just like tips and tricks and training modules and help articles and things like that. So we definitely have those available. I see there's a comment about what if our auditor just, you know, is hounding us about a lack of documentation or minor errors. I have not seen that happen or heard of that happening with our customers. I think most auditors are not looking for things like that, unless like they're typically looking at your SOPs and then comparing against those, while also just keeping in mind like the industry standard for, you know, the regulatory requirements for the like the ISO certifications and things like that you might be needing to comply with. But I don't think they would be looking at those types of small errors or documentation things. But even if they were, having a good justification in your SOP for why something is not needed would definitely go a long way in justifying, you know, not needing to do something like that. So if you know there's documentation that you want to not do anymore because it's, you know, maybe it's burdensome, it's redundant or something, justify that somewhere. Like, we're not going to do this documentation anymore because it's redundant. We have these error checks, you know, in our process. We have mitigation strategies at hand, whatever the case is. If you justify why you're not doing it, you're probably not going to get much pushback. They like it when you can justify your reasoning.
I think we have time for one more in the last minute. I scrolled down to the bottom, and so how do you deal with senior management not understanding validation and what efforts it takes? Yeah, that's a good one. And one of many of the discussions that we even have in the paperless validation COP is how do you get sustainment for it? And you know, you need the top-down support in order to do it. In our case, it actually was top-down and bottom-up. But at the end of the day, it's money. You know, it's how much is this costing? And we talk about piles of paperwork, of non-value-added work. You know, that's time, that's money. And so that's how you need to speak in that language with respect to return on investment, and then how's it going to benefit the business? Meaning, hey, I can get this facility up and licensed faster, and I can get my product to the market, to our patients faster. And that's what, and those are real quantitative savings and you can promote up to them. And these numbers are real that we're hearing, not just within the transition to paperless validation, but then the incorporation of computer system validate or computer software assurance? So that's the last question I think we have time for.
And you know, companies like Kneat do try to take into account usability, how intuitive the program is, which makes it easier to implement. Like, how hard is it to establish a learning curve and you know, get everyone trained up on a new system? One of the mitigation factors to that is making it as intuitive as possible, as user-friendly as possible, so that those kinds of risks can be mitigated. So we do try to take those things into account. We are always, you know, accepting feedback and future requests and all kinds of stuff on our product to make sure that that continues to be as easily implemented as possible. Okay. I think we're at the top of our time now. So we have those upcoming webinars there for anyone who's interested in some additional information about those. And then we've got our contact information there if anyone would like to reach out. Awesome. And then it looks like there's going to be the presentation will be sent out to everyone after the webinar is ended. So everyone will get the slides and the information here. So you'll have those for your reference. All right, great.
Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. Thank you, Michael and Amy, for your excellent talk. As she mentioned, you can see the upcoming webinars there listed on the page. And once again, thank you all for joining. I will then now close the webinar.